And as I often say to him, and I say to anybody else, every time I work with Jared, my respectfulness goes up a notch. And I feel the same way with Joni. As I've got to know her, I see how much she's doing in terms of community action, and what you're doing to try to promote a green economy in the state is just wonderful. A moral green economy is just fabulous. So run with it.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Well, thank you for that introduction. Does it help if I stand? Yes. So it was really wonderful to be invited to present. I liked your pun about the marrying the spiritual and the technological. We are in fact married. And this is the first thing I think that we've ever done professionally together. So exciting.
And you're still married.
I think we're still married. So when we were thinking about what we might want to present at this conference and be in conversation with all of you about, we were reflecting on our professional roles, but also on our own personal story and personal efforts at addressing climate change, reducing our climate pollution, being married and part of the same household and what that means. And so for the next 75 minutes or so, we're hoping to be in conversation with you about what it means theologically and spiritually to be part of a great big household, and also as individuals and community members who lead and are part of households yourselves, and what the practical sides are, implications are for reducing climate pollution as within our own households. And just want to say that we know that not everyone has the privilege of being in control or ownership of their homes and the places they live. And that is a really important equity issue. With this workshop, we are just working from the baseline assumption that those of you participating at the least are interested in these questions, if not yourself able to, currently or in the future, would be part of making decisions about the energy use related to a household. So I'm going to start things off and then pass it to Jared, and we're hoping to have our time be pretty interactive. And it's a great, thank you so much to Marta for leading that last session, and having us end where we did with mental models, because that's actually where I want to begin. And thinking about the theological underpinnings of this conference, of why we're here, why you're here in this workshop for the next 75 minutes or so. And I want to acknowledge that I am, just for the first part, that I am leading us through drawing on the work of a feminist Christian theologian, Sally McFague. Is anyone familiar with that name? Awesome. And so Sally McFague was born in 1933. She died in 2019. As I said, she was a feminist. She had some groundbreaking work on thinking about different models of God, of understanding God in terms of our relationship with God that is different from a kind of father figure, the sort of traditional mental model of God. And then later in her career, she became an eco-theologian and really devoted the last few decades of her life to eco-theology. I'll skip some of the parts of her biography. I was going to mention some other things about her. Mostly just wanted to credit her amazing scholarship and introduction of new mental models. So one of the things that she's done in her work is, this name was also mentioned earlier, which I love the connection, John Cobb, who's a process theologian, who talked about the difference between avowed beliefs and real beliefs. So those beliefs that we say we espouse, but beliefs that we actually make real through our actions, right? So theology is not just about what we think and what we say we believe, but what we do, how we actually embody those beliefs. And I think that we're all here today because we want to have some like hearty, real beliefs, right? We don't want to be people who just sort of say we believe something, but then don't actually enact it. So as a way of bringing ourselves more into the room and introducing ourselves to one another, so great we had some time to do that earlier, I'm going to invite you to think about one belief that you avow, that you also strive to make real through your actions. A belief that you avow, that you espouse, that you also strive to make real through your actions. We have, I've been waiting until this moment to hand this out because I didn't want you looking at it earlier. But I think I'll ask Jared to pass this out. So we made a worksheet. There are a number of different reflection questions throughout our time that will be prompts we'll be giving you, and we just printed them, wrote them out for you, and so you can jot things down on this or any other paper. So as that's going around, you can just be thinking about your response to that question. What is just one? You can just pick one belief that you espouse that you try to make real through your actions. Is that clear enough? Would anyone like an example?
Examples good.
You would like, Linda would like an example. Okay, great. So I'll share this one. A belief that I have is that the earth is a sacred source of life and beauty. It's a belief that I have. And I strive to live with reverence for this sacred source, which for me means being thoughtful about the resources that I use and consume as a living being on this planet. I have a hunch that others might share in this belief who are present here. So if you want to just have a moment, if you feel like writing something down, you can, but you can also just hold that. And then I'll invite you to just turn to a neighbor, someone you haven't already talked to, introduce yourself, and share with them your belief that you're trying to make real through your actions. And I'll call you back together in like 4 minutes. Let me invite you back. It seems like everyone's had a chance to share. Maybe are you still wrapping up that time? Okay, great. Well, it sounded like a lot of really rich conversation happening. Maybe we can take a couple. Does anyone feel like they'd like to share their own, or with permission, your partner?
Susie this year.
Are you willing, Susie?
I am willing.
Okay.
So what my guiding principle is the last 2 lines of a Kenneth Boulding poem. He was an economist, Nobel Prize winning economist and poet and Quaker, I think. And it was, though love is weak and hate is strong, so hate is short and love is very long. And how to live that out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? No pressure. Sure.
So we came up with the sense of both concrete personal actions, but then to people who say there's not enough, we can't do too much, it's overwhelming, to keep in mind also the structural. So the divestment, it's a personal, but it's collective, it's communal, and it's awareness that it's really structural, that the energy companies were the ones who came up with the carbon footprint, so that we would all focus on our little carbon footprints and forget that they're the ones that are driving this almost catastrophe. So keeping both in mind.
Yeah, so believing in both our kind of individual and collective agency, and directing our collective agency towards the real structural power levers of change.
Yes.
Is that a synopsis? Good. Great. Well, thank you all. So I want us to hold that that energy and that space of what are those core beliefs that are really motivating us, and especially in a few moments as we get into more of the nitty-gritty that Jared will lead us into. So it was in preparing for this workshop and digging into Sally McFaig, and some of you are familiar with her work, she part of her work was drawing like other eco-theologians on ecological economics, which is so cool to have literally the person who wrote the workbook on it presenting the keynote earlier today, and just feels so appropriate. And some of us might not think that there's a theological connection there, right, between economics and what we might engage in as people of faith or good conscience, or within our faith communities. And so I think the Sally McFaig's work and other eco-theologians is so valuable because of that connection that's drawn. And you know, she really points out, as others do, that ecological economics has it's right in the words themselves, the oikos, the Greek word for household. And so when we're thinking about ecology and economy, we're thinking about this household that we belong to. And so in terms of the climate crisis, this planetary household that we are all members of. And you know, the earth is our home. In our congregation, I'm pointing out one of the members of my congregation who's in this workshop. Our mission statement includes, right, the last line is protect the earth, our home, right? It's just so fundamental. I think our understanding our relationship to one another and being part of this greater household and sharing that home with other living beings as well. And you know, ecological economics stands in contrast to neoclassical economics, which is based on that free market capitalism that we were talking about earlier. And instead, ecological economics begins with the viability of the whole community on the assumption that only as it thrives now and in the future will its various members, including human beings, thrive as well. So ecological economics, you know, is concerned with the maintenance of the sustainability of this whole household that we are a part of, and also at the same time, how do we maintain that sustainability and meet everyone's needs, right? Not needs and not desires or wants or right, projections of happiness, but our basic needs, and holding those things together in balance. And so the theological part of that is also that there is an acknowledgement that there is something holy and sacred in this household as well, right? I'm, you know, Unitarian Universalist, so no secret that our religious tradition brings together many different theological viewpoints, including people who believe in God and also those who don't. So call it what you will, right? Some might say, and I'm perfectly comfortable saying, right, God is present, the holy is present, spirit, divine love. There is something present in this household along with us, and we are part of that planetary household in which God and spirit, you know, divinity is moving with us, amongst us, drawing us towards change and towards the thriving of all. And so there's the, you know, planetary, but then we can bring it down into smaller and smaller scales of how that household actually operates. And, you know, nation states, communities, down to our own microcosm of a household. I wanted to share this quote as well. Whereas the neoclassical economic model's rules are for individuals, the rules of the ecological economic model are for housemates. So again, back to the mental model. If we switch from thinking of ourselves as just individuals who are competing for scarce resources, but instead we're housemates, right? We're all trying to get along and be part of one household. How does that change the rules by which we live, the rules that we want to set in which all of our needs can be met? So I want to invite you into a second reflection question. to continue to ground us. And that is, what is your vision for how you want to live in the spirit as a member of our planetary household? What is a vision that you have for yourself of being part of this greater spirit that's embodied within this planetary household of which we are all a part? And it can just be a few words. Or it could be a few sentences if you have that in you. And I'll invite you to jot that down. And I think actually, I think we'll save the sharing, but I'll give you a full minute to just break down some words to capture. What is a vision that you have for yourself as a member of our planetary household? All right, I'm going to call us back. Maybe I changed maybe just popcorn a few words. Like if you have a single word that might capture your vision, just call it out. Kindness.
Mindful embrace of love for my neighbor.
Did everyone hear that? Mindful embrace of love for my neighbor.
Leveraging privilege for the common good.
Contributing collaboratively.
Nice. Collaboratively, thank you.
Aware warrior.
Aware warrior. Love it. Last one, yeah.
Enough and not too much.
Enough and not too much. Beautiful. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Jared.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. I think I'm going to share some things from a few different roles and that I play. I think it'll mostly be on behalf of Energy Action Network. Brought a number of copies of our annual progress report for Vermont. Take as many as you want. We have a whole closet full of them. Maybe some things will come up about the Climate Council, but I want to start just as a person and not in any of those roles. And first say it's so good to be back in the Upper Valley. I grew up here between Fairleigh and Lebanon, and hearing the inspiration and the kind of ongoing ripples and inspiration of Donella Meadows' work, kind of framing so much of this gathering and your session earlier, Marta. I went to Lebanon High School, and I remember reading the Valley News and reading her, column every month or every other week, whatever it was. And I was really fortunate. When I was in high school, my mother was the publicity director for Chelsea Green Publishing. This is back when it was a different kind of publisher than it is today. I'll leave that there. But when I was a sophomore in high school, she left on the stairs up to my room an advanced reader's copy of a book by an author named Alan Atkinson called Believing Cassandra, An Optimist Looks at a Pessimist World. And Alan Atkinson was a student of Donella Meadows, and that book changed my whole mental model, my whole worldview, and inspired me to want to become an environmental organizer, a community organizer, and so much of the work of Energy Action Network is we started the entire network back around 2010 with a systems mapping exercise, working to identify leverage points for how we could have durable, effective shift in Vermont's energy system towards the kind of one that we've just been talking about. So lots of threads coming together that I just want to kind of name and honor. I also want to just, before I get into some of the research and analysis part of the wheel of systems change, which is often where I and EAN start with some of our work. I didn't plan this, but after hearing Marta's session and some of John's remarks and some of the conversation throughout the day, I wanted to start with a poem that really underlines for me why it's kind of the spiritual underpinning of the very kind of technical research and analysis work that EAN does. And I'm just going to read half of it. so I don't take too long. But this is a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay. And she wrote, "Upon this gifted age, in its dark hour, rains from the sky a meteoric shower of facts. They lie unquestioned, uncombined. Wisdom enough to leach us of our ill is daily spun, but there exists no loom to weave it into fabric. Undefiled proceeds pure science, and has her say. But still, upon this world, from the collective womb, is spewed all day the red triumphant child." So I've often thought of EAN's work as trying to help build that loom, to weave lots of facts into fabric to help us get some purchase, help us have a common understanding of a narrative of where we are and what it's going to take for us to do our part here in Vermont to be a part of the solution. And so what I want to start with is just a brief overview, and then we're going to actually move to more of my and Joan's personal story about our household. But before I get there, I do want to say, as a member of the Climate Council, the reason I want to kind of pair these two things is I am not comfortable, this is just me personally, I am not comfortable asking anyone else to do something that I'm not willing to do myself. And when I was a kind of starting out as an organizer and an activist, I had this kind of duality in my mind. And it was, I would often ask this question, comparing the importance of personal action versus policy change and political action. And to me, it's not an either or question. It's about doing both. We have the capacity to do multiple things at the same time. And so for me, yes, we very much need to focus on political and policy change at the structural level in order to be able to especially have an equitable transition where we're not saying to folks who don't have the resources or the means to make a change, we need to be making sure that not only do we change how our energy is used, but that it's an equitable transition that builds a more equitable economy at the same time. But that I think at the same time, we shouldn't say that policy or political action is the only thing that matters. It's also important for us to walk the walk. And so that's where this kind of second presentation will lead, which was our commitment to get totally off of fossil fuels and what would that look like. So to start, this is Vermont's historic emissions. In the green is transportation, and the orange is kind of our heating sector. And you see those green dots out there, that's what we are legally required as a state to reduce our emissions to in 2025, 2030, and 2050. And one of the things that's interesting about Vermont is that we are different than the country as a whole in terms of where our climate pollution comes from, with the vast majority, 74%, coming from how we get around and how we heat our homes and buildings. These sources of climate pollution shouldn't be ignored, but it's very important that we have developed many policies to get at some of these other sectors. We have not effectively focused on the elephants in the room of our transportation and thermal sector pollution. This is just another view of the same way of looking at Vermont's climate pollution. Again, transportation and how we heat our homes and buildings are the two largest sources of emissions. And it's not just about emissions. This is also really costly to household budgets. We think about the amount of money spent on energy. Most of it is on transportation and heating as compared to electricity. So let's just start with transportation. The vast majority of our transportation energy is gasoline, a little less diesel, and the vast majority of those emissions come from our light-duty fleet. I think oftentimes there's this desire to want to point to a big other to hold responsible, but the vast majority of that 71% of emissions is the 580,000 vehicles in our mostly light-duty vehicle fleet. And that's all of our vehicles added up. And so it is important to focus on them one by one, and it's not just, we can't just say, we're going to deal with heavy-duty diesel vehicles, that'll solve it. That's only 11% of our emissions. The biggest factor is the size of our light-duty fleet and all the gasoline that it uses. It's a similar story on the heating side, although a little bit more complex. We've got most Vermonters are heating with fuel oil, natural gas, propane, or wood. And the majority of the emissions from this residential, commercial, industrial fuel use come from residential heating. About a third from commercial, but only 15% from industrial. So this is also how Vermont is different than the country as a whole or from other countries, is that for us to do our part, and that's kind of an unspoken mental model here, right? It's not that Vermont is going to solve this, but that we do have a responsibility to do our part. And so what our part looks like should be based on what is unique about Vermont and how do we respond to that. Also, because we actually pollute, in terms of the climate pollution, much more than any other surrounding state in the region. We have the highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions in the Northeast, and it's primarily because of all that gasoline and diesel we use for transportation and all that fuel oil, propane, and natural gas we use for heating. So you see the per capita emissions here. This is the latest year we could get comparable data from across every state in the region. And so this is what it looks like brought from the total level of 7.35 billion vehicle miles traveled on Vermont roads each year, down to the personal level. So the average vehicle in Vermont, it's about 12,666 miles traveled per year. The average fuel efficiency of a vehicle in Vermont is only 23 miles per gallon. And so what that adds up to is each vehicle in Vermont using over 550 gallons of gasoline each year and about 5 million metric tons. So if you go back a slide, per capita emissions, what each of us on average are responsible for is over 15 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions. And so a full third of that is usually from the vehicle we drive, usually. And here's what it looks like on the heating side. Total amounts of that fossil fuel burning per person, the technical term is the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector, 4.7 metric tons. But for reference, if you heat with fuel oil, say you use 500 gallons in a winter, that's over 5 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's a third of the average Vermonter's climate pollution. So there's also this talking point out there, right, that, oh, well, Vermont is so small, we shouldn't do anything. What about China and India? Well, what about China and India? The average person in India, per capita emissions in India, 2 tons per person. 2 tons per person. So from a climate justice perspective, both currently and historically, I almost think of it like a barn raising, right? It's really easy if we all do our part, but if certain people start peeling off saying, oh, I don't want to be part of this, the load gets a lot heavier for others, and the ones that have the most resources and ability to raise that barn should be pushing forward. And we do. Per capita, Vermont has the know-how, the resources to really help lead the way. I think that the equity lens of this is really important, that the largest share of responsibility for reducing pollution should be on upper income folks, because on average, they're consuming far more than lower income folks. And this is true both in terms of gasoline and vehicle miles. It's also true, well, so even though the wealthiest folks, are sometimes consuming twice as much gasoline in a year as lower income folks, the share of income, or the energy burden, the share of household income that's spent on that energy is far higher for lower income households. So twice as much fossil fuel use over there, but only 2% of a $200,000 a year household's budget. It doesn't bother them as much. But if your household income is down below $50,000, the spending that you have on gasoline is a major stressor and burden on your household budget. Same story on this is combined heating and electricity. Wealthier folks are consuming a lot more, but the share of income that goes to those resources is a lot higher for lower income folks. This graphic really shows two things. It is the high cost and it is the price volatility of fossil fuel options. So you see propane in the gray, you see kerosene in the pink, fuel oil in the purple. Those numbers have gone up significantly. I think fuel oil is now, the last time I looked, over $4.60 a gallon. So those sharp lines at the far end have only continued to go up. Whereas a lot of the alternatives that we are identifying as opportunities to heat our homes instead, whether it's cold climate heat pumps, whether it's advanced efficient wood heat, they're both lower cost and much more price stable over time. And it's the same story on the transportation side. You see the average higher cost and much greater price volatility on gas and diesel, and the lower amount for EVs. So including the off-peak rates, which you see in the green dots. So like, we're in Green Mountain Power territory, we have an EV charger in our garage, it's the equivalent of $1 a gallon to charge. And in terms of, if we expand the household to the state of Vermont, 100% of the fossil fuel we use is imported into the state. And so the vast majority of it is spent on the commodity price of that rather than the labor. And so most of those energy dollars that we spend leave the state economy. With electricity, that equation is very different, because when we spend $1 on electricity, most of it is going to line workers, tree trimmers, customer service representatives, local power purchases. So we keep and recirculate much more money in the Vermont economy when we move away from imported fossil fuels. And you know, it's $1.5 billion a year that is draining out of the state economy because of our fossil fuel dependence. So that's the stop of the first part. I want to pause and see if there's any kind of questions or comments before we move to the more interactive part, which is going to be on the household. But I wanted to set that context first. I'll try to look to see if, yes.
Yeah, I'm surprised about how many of my assumptions were wrong. So thank you for the facts.
Do you mind sharing it if you're comfortable with one of those assumptions?
Yeah, I mean, I just didn't realize that the individual use and individual home and things were such a large percentage. I just always thought, you know, it's a big industry.
Yeah. No, I've had conversations with legislators, I will leave them unnamed because I think this is being recorded, but who said, oh, if we want to do something about transportation emissions, let's focus on all those flights out of Burlington International. You look at the jet fuel numbers, jet fuel and aviation gasoline is responsible for 3% of Vermont's transportation emissions. And so it's the mental model, right? We think of a big airplane, but it's all of those small cars that add up to a huge impact in terms of fuel use and pollution. So this is our home. And we moved here, we moved in 2014, and it's an old 1880 house that was very leaky and very fossil fuel intensive, very expensive our first winter. So this is kind of what the basement looked like, what the attic looked like. This house had been on the market for 2 years. There was a reason for that. You know, this was the bulkhead, that drop ceiling in my office.
Oh, that was your office.
There was it was literally a roof, no insulation, and a styrofoam drop ceiling.
Whoa, cozy.
So and this was our furnace with asbestos wrapped ductwork in the basement. That was the old fuel oil water heater, and we had an open fire. We didn't use the open fireplace much, but I think that's like the only picture I have of us using it. But that was the heating. It was a forced hot air furnace, fuel oil water heater, and a fireplace. So what that meant was, in our first winter, we moved in the fall, we didn't have time to do anything, over 1,000 gallons of fuel oil. That's over 10 tons of climate pollution that we were responsible for. And in that winter, we spent approximately $2,400. So do the math. Fuel oil was about $2.40 a gallon. Imagine we were still in that situation this winter. It would have been nearly $5,000. I think the latest I saw, fuel oil was $4.60 some odd a gallon. And so we went from that situation to say, okay, well, I know we were talking earlier about not starting with the problems, but sometimes I start with a problem statement. We were using a dirty, polluting fuel, exposed to volatile and unpredictable prices, sending our heating dollars out of state, worried about the health of us and our son, and we were never that warm or comfortable. So we used 1,000 gallons of fuel oil, and that was keeping the thermostat, I think it was like 65 degrees. And so the very next spring, we said, we're going to do something different. And here were the goals that we started with. Reduce fossil fuel use as much as possible. In 2014, we didn't know if we could get fully off. We have gotten fully off of fossil fuel for as of 4 years ago. We wanted to support the Vermont economy by using local renewable energy, improve comfort, and save money. And we've been able to do all of these things because of the support and the resources of an amazing ecosystem that exists in Vermont, from Efficiency Vermont to local renewable energy and efficiency contractors. And we're going to provide some resources at the end. You're probably already familiar with many of them, but in case not, they're really helpful. So the first thing we had was an energy audit by Energy Smart. That was our air leakage rate, 5,000 cubic feet a minute. And you know, that, not surprising when your foundation looks like that, right? We had our foundation repaired as part of the energy efficiency project. And then we got this report with a proposed scope of work. It said, here's how much it's going to do. We proposed it was $11,000 that they proposed, mostly in the attic, basement, air sealing. And we did all of that with a loan. We had a newborn son. We didn't have any savings. So we took out an home energy loan from VSECU, where the interest rate is bought down for energy efficiency projects. And then we had spray foam in the basement. We had, you know, the new bulkhead, new insulation in the attic, blown-in cellulose in the attic. And the reading afterwards, 2,500. So we cut our heat loss in half thanks to that whole home weatherization project. And then we put in, that enabled us to heat our whole home with a pellet stove made in Morrisville, Vermont, with wood pellets from Clarendon, Vermont. Our son, who is in that picture, probably what, 3? He's 8 years old upstairs now. So that's the main source of heat for our house now, is the pellet stove. And the backup is we still have our fuel oil furnace, or I should say our furnace. We run on B100 biodiesel that we get from Black Bear or Bourne's locally from recycled restaurant oil. And so this is what it changed from. First winter, a couple winters after that, and now that we have access to B100 biodiesel. So since 2017, totally off of fossil fuels. And the benefit there isn't just for the climate, it's that we're spending so much less to heat our home, we're more comfortable. Heat pump water heater was part of it, you see on the right. So the first thing that we did on the transportation side was, okay, we can't get off fossil fuels, but I was able to find a used Volkswagen diesel Jetta that we could run on biodiesel, run over to Plainfield, get it. But then thankfully, we were able to get a Nissan. I think a lot of people think EVs are like for the wealthy, or they're some like elitist thing. We paid $200 a month for this Nissan Leaf. And the Nissan Leaf is the best-selling EV in Vermont. And I think the Chevy Bolt is the second. So we're not talking, luxury cars here. And so between those things, we've been able to get off of fossil fuel for heating and transportation, those two largest sources of pollution. And again, these were the resources. Drive Electric Vermont. If any of you are not familiar with this website, it is the most user-friendly, helpful resource that has all the information you could need. And the same is true for Efficiency Vermont or your electric utility or your fuel dealer. Many of them have resources for kind of how to do this on a personal level. So I imagine most of you have already thought about this, have already done a lot of this, and have your own stories to share. And so what we were hoping on the sheet with those prompts is, if you haven't, just start with those questions of, how do I heat my home now? How do I travel? How many miles is that? And then there's a really helpful resource at the bottom from the EPA that has the greenhouse gas equivalencies calculator. So you can get a sense of, how much does that add up to? If you want to think in that kind of micro level of doing your individual household part as being part of a larger household. But of course, being part of that larger household, depending on your resources, there's a responsibility of the broader community and of our government to provide, and our utilities to provide incentives to help with that. So I think that's why these resources are really important. So I guess I would, let's pause for a few minutes so you can respond to some of those prompts. And then I think we'll hopefully have some time. I'm going to have to look at the clock and see how we're doing, to either share kind of, kind of a situation that you're in and kind of what your hoped for change would be, or if you have your own kind of brief example or story of how you've changed your household to be more in line with your real beliefs, not your avowed beliefs, then that would be great.
Do you want to see if there are any questions first?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Any questions?
So, did you take advantage of the Mileage Smart program to get your leaf, or did you lease it?
We leased it.
Yeah.
And which enabled us to still get the utility incentive.
Oh, cool.
Through Tier 3 of the renewable energy, so through Green Mountain Power. But there are great programs that are just rolling out now. One is Mileage Smart, where you can get a used vehicle, either a hybrid or an EV. It doesn't have to be a new EV. I think you took advantage of it.
Yeah, I did, and I'm such a huge fan. It was the opportunity for me to get into an electric vehicle. And I got a 2017 Nissan. Yours is a Nissan. The Chevy Bolt, and I love it. So.
And the other program that's coming out this summer is called Replace Your Ride. So if you've got an older, gasoline or diesel vehicle, you can have trade. It's almost like cash for clunkers, but it's updated. So you turn that in, it gets scrapped. If it's an inefficient older gas vehicle, and then you can get money towards the purchase of a more efficient vehicle, which could be a hybrid or an electric vehicle. Linda.
I just want to share, here yesterday we had an EV show and tell event that was well attended, and there was somebody from Thetford who was here with her, I believe, 2021 Leaf, and she was leasing it, a 2-year lease, and she was paying $60 a month.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Wow.
I want that deal.
So I imagine that some of the incentives that apply to her may have been income related. I don't know anything about her income situation, but still, that was pretty impressive. I sent lots of people over to listen to her story.
Yeah. And there's the maintenance savings. I mean, in the 3 years we've had an EV, the only thing we've done on it is change the tires. So,
windshield washer fluid. That's been my biggest expense so far.
Do you want people to take some time with
let's
that?
take a couple of minutes, take some notes to respond to those questions, and then we'll come back and see how much time we have left and what we can do for some sharing. All right, so I want to ask a few questions, and we can just see sense of the room, show of hands, stealing my wife's good idea that she mentioned during the break. So I'm just curious, how many folks have had their home, or if you're renting, has the apartment that you're in, has your landlord had weatherized to some degree? Okay, so it looks like 2/3 of folks. Great. How many folks are in a situation where your primary heating fuel is fossil fuel? It's fuel oil. That's the plurality. That's the predominant source of heating in Vermont. How many folks primary fuel oil? Yep. So a couple. So this room is not representative of the state of Vermont, of which about 40% of the room would have said yes. How about propane?
We just got Douglas heat pumps in like November, and I'm not real clear on exactly how it's all shaken out yet.
Yep. In terms of the balance,
Right.
because you probably still got
It
propane
did
as
get
backup.
cold, yes.
Yep. Yep. How about wood in some form, either a wood stove, boiler, pellets as a primary? So that's okay, not primary. Okay. So are there kind of, as you did that reflection and kind of wrote down, are there like, is there either like a question you're wrestling with, or do you have a story or an example that you want to share with the group about how you've approached this?
Question I'm wrestling with.
Yeah.
And both our church, which has done similar things and continues to try to. We said it's net zero, but we're 40%. We got, from where we were, a benchmark down to 40% of what it used to be. But that's still a long way. And we've plateaued out. We can't get it. My home, I've had the same experience. Took measures, plateaued out, got natural gas boilers. And what do you do with a natural gas boiler? There's a lot of skepticism among us, I think, about the green gas that Vermont Gas is offering. And I said, wondering where that's going. I've heard things about a heat pump that could be a substitute for a gas boiler, but that would be a hydronic system. But that's that's my question.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that actually some of the biggest challenges from an economics perspective are for folks who are in fossil gas territory, in VGS territory.
But economics aside, it's just technologically there aren't a lot of options either.
Yeah. Well, I always kind of defer to Efficiency Vermont because they're on the cutting edge of, there's just so many different variations of heat pump systems from, air to air, air to water, geothermal systems, and that technology I feel like is always. So I would check with them. I'm not actually familiar with it. I do know that there's a big effort in VGS territory to install a lot of heat pump water heaters to replace fossil gas water heaters, which is exciting. But
you talked about heating your home with wood. Is that really? I mean, emissions-wise, and that's an issue. I mean, we just watched the documentary on TV the other night about generating electricity with wood and how terrible that is. How is heating your home with wood better?
Yeah, it's a great and a really important question. So it's an important distinction that being fossil fuel free is not being zero emissions. Certainly, if what is replacing that is wood heat or is a biofuel. But there's a few things that I would say about that. One is that there's a big difference in terms of the efficiency and in terms of the emissions for biomass electricity versus home heating. So on average, biomass electricity is only 20% efficient. You're burning 5 trees to get the energy content of 1, whereas home heating, it's usually 80% efficient. So you're using a lot more of that energy rather than it being wasted. So I think there is a really important distinction between using biomass for electricity versus biomass for heating. I think the second is, often we hear this term, decarbonize electricity and electrify everything. And I think in milder climates, that certainly should be a goal. But again, I want to go back to this, I'm not willing to ask anyone else to do something that I'm not willing to do. And being in Vermont's climate, we have a spread out house where to heat pump the whole thing would have been either impractical or way too expensive for what we could have done. And so for me, the question wasn't, is wood perfect? Is it carbon neutral? Some people will claim that it is because those trees will regrow over a certain time frame. I don't subscribe to that. But is it substantially better than continuing to use fuel oil? And so for me, I think one of the most important distinctions is recognizing that every energy choice has a cost and it has a problem associated with it. and it's comparing them against each other. So for me, I don't think wood is perfect, but I think it was far better from a climate perspective, from an ecosystem perspective, and from an economics perspective than the fuel oil that we were using. And then the last thing I would say on that is that I do think that there is an important distinction between the sources of emissions being biogenic or being geologic. And so I think it's very fair to say that, like, when you burn wood heat, whether it's, from wood from your property, a lot of Vermonters do that, you get free firewood, or whether it's from wood pellets, there is a pulse of emissions that is kind of out of sync with that biogenic cycle. But it's still from within that existing amount of carbon that's in a biogenic cycle. Whereas when we take carbon that has been buried underground for millions of years and add it to the carbon cycle, we can't get it back out of the, well, there are some people who claim technologies for how we can, but to me, if we can sustainably, responsibly use in those instances where there is a need, either for resilience purposes or for heating purposes because of our cold climate, if we need some form of combustion, responsible use of wood heat to me is a better option than fossil fuel. Not that it's perfect, but I don't think we, unfortunately, are in this situation where we can. I certainly wouldn't recommend to anybody in an old house, even an old weatherized house, as big, it's like 2,000 square feet, to only rely on heat pumps, at least in their current technology. I think it is important in our climate to have backup and resilient sources of heat. So I think wood can and should play a limited role.
I'm also going to put in a plug for the Nissan Leaf, which I love, but I would also say that I could write an article called Adventures in Charging. So I think that's a missing piece, is the infrastructure for charging. Great commuter car, but I have tried to go to Boston, or and plotted my path, and where can I? So there's a missing piece for sure that I'm very much looking forward to seeing come online for us, because it's a wonderful car and I love it, but I have 2 passengers and I'm saying, oh, I wonder if I should run out and charge now before I try to drive them back to Middlebury. So the challenge remains.
We had quite the adventure driving to and from Cape Cod in the previous iteration of the previous model of the Leaf. If anyone would like to hear that story later, you can chat.
Well, you know there are 2 chargers up at the general store.
Yes, I looked that up. Thank you very much.
And at King Arthur Flowers.
Yes, thank you.
Actually, the one at King Arthur Flowers is not working. Hasn't been for quite a while.
Yeah, that's the bad one. They're not on.
Well,
So I think we're going to, Diana, and then, I'm sorry, I don't see your name.
I'm Kim.
Kim.
So I have a follow-up question to the question about burning wood, and this is not a rhetorical question. It's a serious question for Jared or whoever else has an answer. Is it possible in Vermont to heat a house without burning something?
So
Depends on the house.
yeah,
depends on how cold it gets in the winter.
Well, in Vermont.
Yeah.
In Vermont.
no, I mean, I would defer to like kind of the experts at Efficiency Vermont and elsewhere, but from what I've gathered from that interconnected web of wisdom across our network, is that yes, it's possible if it's a kind of an open space and it's a small square footage.
Okay.
Bigger homes that aren't weatherized or that have lots of kind of pockets with doors, it's difficult to carry that heat load. So you'll see like the Vermonts that are built in Wilder are constructed to be super efficient and be able to be heated with a heat pump as their sole or primary heating source. But I think that most of Vermont's housing stock, we have a chart in the annual report, it's very old, and a lot of our housing stock is very leaky. And in that situation, I think the most important thing is first weatherize and then add heat pumps, so you're using that heat pump as efficiently as possible. But like, I do think it's important from a resilience perspective to have a redundant or a backup source of heat. And in that case, I think that oftentimes sustainable, efficient use with modern wood heating equipment that's EPA certified, not like outdoor wood boilers or pre-1988 wood stoves, is really appropriate.
Betsy is an example of.
Yeah, but Kim was next, and I could go after
Okay.
Kim maybe.
So I have a question. Is there one website that has all, I'm very familiar with most of the websites you mentioned, but I'm not familiar with Replace My Ride. Is that new?
It's a new program that was authorized and funded by the legislature last year.
Okay.
They just hired the position in the last 6 months at the Agency of Transportation, and they're going to try to basically align it with all the state incentive programs. So it should be up soon on like the Drive Electric website.
Okay.
You should see it as a resource. Hopefully some of the utilities will have it up on their websites as well. But I feel like either Drive Electric Vermont or Efficiency Vermont, if I have to recommend one starting point, and they tend to update it pretty quickly as well, and really helpful just like customer service when people call. So.
I mean, I put together a resource for low-income people and all Vermonters actually on all the different websites, and I didn't know about Mileage Smart for a year. I'm like, there's got to be a better way to communicate all this stuff.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to share that my house is an older one. It was built in 1907. I did weatherized first, had it weatherized first, and then put in heat pumps. But it's an older house. It doesn't have the open plan, floor plan. So I did add a small addition, but that's another story. Even before that, so there was one heat pump upstairs and one on a smaller one upstairs, a larger one on the first floor. And you just don't close the doors.
Yeah.
And like the wood stove, the room where the heat pump is going to be the warmest room, and the farther away you get, the cooler it's going to be. And I wear layers, But I do have a wood stove for backup. But most years, if I burn a quarter of a cord of wood, that's a lot, And some of that burning was just for the ambiance, because my kids were home and they wanted a fire. So I don't burn a lot of. This year, January was so cold. I burned a little more, but I'm sure it wasn't even half a cord that I burned. So yes, you can heat even old homes.
Yes.
In Vermont with,
Yeah, and even if it can't meet everything, it can displace a huge amount of fossil fuels, even if you're keeping those backup sources. Yeah.
I wonder if we want to, I think our time is coming to
Yeah,
a close. I wonder if we want to just, if we want to end with, we had a final question on that worksheet about a commitment you can take to a next step. So if that's feeling like an inviting reflection for you right now, and you want to write something down that you can hold on to. I mean, it could be as simple as like, check out that website that Jared mentioned, or talk with some more people I know about other options than whatever it might be. Just write that down, and that'll be something you can take away from our time together.
That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.